hell is happening here?
It says you're live.
Yeah, okay. I guess I am, so
You just can't see us.
uh, well, that looks a little better. I don't know what happened here. This is very strange. Oh, I don't know what that is at all.
Yeah, it says you're live and here on Facebook, but it just has the same empowering democracy screen.
Yeah, I haven't put back. Let's see. We got some comments. Uh,
Yes, I see Evelyn. It says she can hear us, and Steve says hello, everybody.
Hello, folks. I'm having a few technical difficulties here because StreamYard has changed a few things. And not to put too fine a point on it, right at this moment, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. So if you'll give me a minute to straighten this out.
And to share the show wherever you can.
Yeah, do share the show while we're trying to make this go. Well, the horizontal alignment is good. The fit says it's good. Maybe it's my, oh yeah, my,
Mhm.
oh God. I don't know what all these new things mean. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem exactly. They keep changing things. You know how things are going, and then, oh, it's time to change.
Unless it's time to change, and they don't really tell you very much.
No.
So all of a sudden, something's changed, and this is different. I had something going on recently that was like this. And I was able to hack my way through it then. But at this point, well, let's see.
Earl of Lurl is here.
Oh, hi, Earl. Oh, well, that's even more confusing. This is really screwed up. Maybe I'll just refresh, reload the site.
Okay.
Okay, that didn't work.
Wonder if you put one of the articles up, if somehow that would change anything.
Okay, I'm going to share this on Facebook first.
Okay.
Did you ever feel the need for a producer?
Sometimes I do, yes. Especially you know what's going on and they change it.
Yeah, and they back you up. Seems to me,
Yes.
it seems to me like I need a producer.
Hmm.
Plus a new layout, edit layout. Maybe that'll tell me. Nope, that's not doing anything. Maybe I can stretch this. Uh, oh boy, that made it worse.
It looks the same over here. So
It looks
mhm.
very, the panel looks very small for some reason. Looks even smaller now. Oh, now it looks normal. Now it looks normal. I think I hacked my way through it.
Oh,
Hello,
good.
everybody. We're a little late today getting started. Evelina says they must do this on purpose. Yeah.
Hmm.
So, Evelina hears us. Steve says hello, everybody. Steve is shared. Earl of Durham says hi, Steve. Hi, Joe D. Yep, there we are. I guess we are in a position now to do the usual. And now, if I don't forget how I solved this problem, it will never happen in the future.
Yeah, yeah, well, we still have the empowering democracy screen up.
Yes, I think people can probably see us now. Well,
No,
I
they
have,
can't see us. They see. Oh, now they can.
yeah, now they,
Now it shows. Yes.
yeah, but it's showing the StreamYard overlay. I didn't mean to do that.
No,
Now
but at least they can see you. Yes.
they can see us now, and it's regular. So I don't.
Yes. Everything is cool.
Okay, so our topic for tonight is. Oh, by the way, just to go through it, this is empowering democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. You're all thumbs host, Joe Firestone. I'm joined by my good friend, the host of Around the World with with D and Friends, D Pierce. Thank you for coming, D, and for joining me,
Happy to be here.
and for figuratively holding my hand while I hack through this little mess. Uh, and so now we're going to go to our topic, are the cause of the Ukraine war,
Hmm.
the moral meltdown of Israel, the Putin/Trump phone call, uh, what's likely to happen, or what changes we may see in the relationship of the United States to China following the tariff fiasco we've gone through. Uh, okay, then we have another piece, okay, by Alistair Crook, dealing with the transition to a new order. That will be very interesting. And then something that's not showing up in the announcement to the stream because I added it to the last minute. We're going to play a little part of a video uh, uh, by Nima Al-Kashid, okay, and Colonel Wilkerson, okay, Larry Wilkerson. We'll play about 16 minutes of that because Larry had some very choice words to say about whether we're on a collision course with Iran or not. So, with that, and having already shared on Facebook, I am going to share the screen here for the first of our blog pieces. This is from Larry Johnson and his blog, Sonar 21, and it was written on the 18th of May, 2025. It's by Larry C. Johnson. It's called Another Look at Root Causes of War in Ukraine. And here we are. Uh, I don't know why there's a picture, of Gobelki Terra, 11,000 BC here. I don't know why that would be a cause of war, but
Mm.
that is part of this graphic. And then there's something about here, NATO and OTAN in Washington, D.C. I confess I don't understand the significance of that graphic, but it looks attractive, so it's very good. So, starting off, Donald Trump continues to orient his policy towards Russia based on at least three faulty wrong assumptions. That's great, huh? Base policy toward Russia on three faulty wrong assumptions. First, he believes that Russia is suffering massive casualties and cannot sustain these losses. Second, he believes that Russia's attack on Ukraine was based on some personal sort of animus on the part of Vladimir Putin. Boy, is he operating on false assumptions. Third, he believes that the war is causing great strains on the Russian economy and that Putin is looking for a way out. Just before this show, I was watching a bit of a video from Alexander uh, um, 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 from Alexander Mercouris, who is in St. Petersburg, okay, right now,
Mhm.
who spent a few days there. And he said he noticed absolutely no economic difficulty in St. Petersburg. Looked as if everybody was doing very well. There was no sign of any strain, and he had been having a good time in that great city. So that's the opinion of one acute observer. Uh, anyway, Larry Johnson says Trump is mistaken on every single point. In a recent article, I posted an image of a graph listing the exchange of Russia dead for Ukrainian dead. Note, the graph was incorrectly titled by its author as the Second World War. Yes, I noticed that too, and said so when we covered that particular that article of Larry's. But then goes on to say of the three exchanges that have taken place since March 28th, there are at least 25 Ukrainian cadavers for each Russian soldier. Not only does this show the disproportionate losses on the part of the Ukrainians, but it also is an indicator of the increasing speed of the Russian advance along the line of contact. If you want a good, reliable source for tracking Russian progress on the battlefields in Ukraine, I recommend you follow the Substack of Marat K. Rulin, and he leaves a link to that Substack. Larry does. I guess that's where these body counts actually came from. But you can see again, these ratios here are just incredible. Like 909 fatalities to 34 fatalities on the other side, or at least
Mhm.
insofar as cadavers actually represent fatalities. Uh, and the ratios keep getting higher. On the left hand side of the graph, uh, at one point, they look like they're fairly equal. And as the war goes on, you see the ratios going higher and higher uh, in terms of the number of Ukrainians who are killed versus the number of Russians who are killed. As far as President Putin's uh, 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 motives for launching the uh, military operation, special military operation, February of 2022. It is very simple. Stop NATO's advance to the east. I don't know if Donald Trump is putting on an act or if he genuinely believes that Russia attacked Ukraine because the Russians don't like the Ukrainians. Regardless, Ukraine is a pawn of the West, and it is NATO's documented efforts dating back in 1995 to cultivate Ukraine as a battering ram to attack and destroy Russia. From Putin's perspective, negotiations with Ukraine are only the first step in a much larger process, which ultimately must include NATO. Russia wants a permanent end to NATO military exercises on its borders. Larry says, I discussed this in detail with Clayton Morris of the Redacted program. We're not going to play that video here, but I'm sure it's a good video.
Okay.
If you think I am just offering up an unfounded opinion, think again. I encourage you to watch the following interview with Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. I believe this was recorded on Saturday after the meeting in Istanbul of the Russians and Ukrainian delegations. Lavrov was not a part of that meeting, but he provides a detailed explanation of Russia's policy position on the matter. What about Russia's economy? 2024, Russia's economy experienced notable growth, with official statistics reporting a 4.3 increase in GDP, up from 3.6% in 2023, and by the way, considerably higher than the rise in GDP here in the US. This acceleration was primarily driven by heightened government spending related to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, particularly in sectors like construction and defense. Many so-called experts in the West, particularly in the US, continue to insist that Russia's economy is on the verge of collapse. This is pretty funny, considering that in 2024, the US economy experienced a real GDP growth of 2.8%, according to the US Bureau of Economic Analysis. This growth was driven by increases in consumer spending, investment, government expenditures, and exports. Russia and the US share a common characteristic that sets them apart from the vast majority of countries in the world, including China and India. Both are blessed with an abundance of natural resources. In this regard, Russia holds an edge over the United States because it is largely self-sufficient, i.e. can produce everything it needs internally in terms of food and energy without relying on imports. The United States, by contrast, is dependent on imports for a significant portion of its economic growth. For example, the U.S. lacks the processing facilities for rare earth minerals that are critical components in the manufacture of key military and high-tech products, while Russia does not. And you remember the article we went over on Saturday from Hua Bin, which made the case very successfully that we are utterly dependent for our rare earths on China. We have rare earths here, and we have mines here, and we would not necessarily have to be dependent on China, but we utterly lack the processing facilities for the rare earths. So what we do is after we mine them here, we send them to China for the elements to be extracted. We send them to processing and manufacturing facilities in China. Then they send the rare earth elements back to us, and then we incorporate them into our arms manufacturing industry. Quite ironic. Then there is the issue of government debts. As of 2024, Russia's government debt is estimated to be between 14.5% and 20.3% of its gross domestic product, depending on the source, okay, and the methodology used. Uh, the size of the deficit compared to the GDP, or I should say the size of the debt compared to the GDP, uh, uh, is, according to the MMT approach to economics, which I specialize in, and which I argued in many of my books, that particular ratio is of no importance when it comes to fiscal sustainability. So it may be nice that Russia has a ratio of debt to GDP of 14.5% and 20.3%, okay, of its GDP, uh, and that ours is much greater, as is indicated in the next sentence. Reading it now. The contrast with the U.S. is staggering. As of the end of 2024, the United States national debt stood at approximately 35.5 billion. Of course, now it's something like 36.5 trillion. I should say trillion, not billion, marking an increase of 2.3 trillion from the previous fiscal year. This debt level represents about 124% of the nation's GDP. Okay, that difference, 14.5% and 20.3%, doesn't make any difference because the U.S. is a monetary sovereign, and it doesn't matter how high the debt to GDP ratio is. We can always pay whatever interest is due on the debt and whatever principal is due on the debt while it falls due, because we create our money and our currency sovereign. I think the Russians are now also very close to currency sovereignty themselves. So in that case, they could just as well be running 150% of GDP, and they wouldn't have any fiscal sustainability problems. I don't believe they have realized that yet. But going on with the article, it is the height of arrogance for U.S. officials to claim Russia's economy is struggling in the wake of recent news that Moody's downgraded the U.S. credit rating from its top tier AAA to AA1, citing concerns over the escalating debt and persistent fiscal deficits. This downgrade follows similar actions by S&P in 2011 and Fitch in 2023. Now, Larry neglects here that Moody's once before downgraded our credit rating. That was in 2011, also about the same time S&P did. And guess what? It had absolutely no influence on our fiscal sustainability at all. It had no influence on our ability to sell bonds, okay, at all. And, okay, of course, we're now running $36.5 trillion, okay, in debt. If I recall correctly, at least I wouldn't be surprised. I'm going to take a guess here. My guess is that when Moody's downgraded us in 2011, by the way, I wrote a blog on that at the time. I wrote a blog on S&P also at that time. Those blogs may be found at Daily Costs. Okay, but anyway, I think our debt was about $11 trillion then. It's now about $35.5 trillion. I haven't noticed any problems in fiscal sustainability all this time. We have a lot of histrionics in Congress all the time about the debt ceiling. This is pure politics, but the Constitution does not allow us to default on our debts. Specifically, the 14th Amendment does not allow us to default on our debts, nor is there any incapacity thereof, because we can always decide just to stop issuing debt, to issue platinum coins, to cover any debt and any interest that are falling due. In fact, we could just issue $100 trillion platinum coin if we wanted to, and have the proceeds go into the Treasury spending account, and then we could pay off all of our national debt as it falls due over a period of 30 years, because there's some 30-year debt. So, but if we wanted to, we would not have to owe anything in terms of national debt. Though some people like the fact that we have debt because they view the issuance of debt as uh, as a way of draining money out of the economy, and therefore as a hedge against the possibility of inflation. I do not view it that way because I think that the holding of bonds, okay, as assets can actually be more inflationary than the holding of cash, okay, as assets. But that's an argument for another day. To summarize, Donald Trump does not hold any trump cards going on with the article now. He can play against Russia. But Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, is in a solid position to continue defending Russia's national security concerns. Under Putin, the Russian economy has grown from 7% in 1995 to an estimated 50% in 2024. I'm not sure what he intended to say there. Perhaps he meant to say that it was 7% of the U.S. GDP in 1995, and it's now an estimated 50%. I'm not sure. He just kind of garbled that statement. In the United States, the percentage of people classified as middle class has shrunk. Yeah, this statistic is correct. In 1995, approximately 56% of U.S. adults lived in middle class households. This was a period of economic expansion, with median household income increasing by 2.7% from 33,178 in 1994 to 34,076 in 1995. By 2024, the share of Americans in middle class households had decreased to 51%, according to the Pew Research Center, based on what I personally witnessed in Moscow and St. Petersburg. The Russian people are doing better than the Americans when it comes to the economy. An interesting observation. On the military side of the ledger, Russia has produced at least 3 operational hypersonic missiles that have been used effectively in combat operations. That's a little bit of an unfortunate statement. I think it's at least 3 types of operational hypersonic missiles that have been used effectively in combat operations. I think the number of hypersonic missiles that they have available to them certainly numbers in the hundreds, if not in the thousands. Okay, but there are at least 3 types. Trying to remember what the names are, but I think the Iskander, the Zircon, and there's one more that's the fastest of all the 3, which I have forgotten. I think also the Oreshnik represents a 4th type. But anyway, the U.S. has 0. Russia's army is at least twice the size of the U.S. It seems to me it's closer to 3 times the size, because I think the U.S. is, they supposedly were expanding the Russian army to 1.5 million people. And my understanding is the U.S. army is now only 440,000. So it's more like 3 times the size. Donald Trump is deluding himself and the American people with his repeated claim that the U.S. has, the best military in the world. Hell, we could not stop the Houthis. Russia is methodically destroying a NATO proxy army in Ukraine. No brag, just facts. Okay, I agree that this is true. We could not stop the Houthis, but this by itself doesn't debunk the claim, because If the Russians wanted to, I don't think they could stop the Houthis either.
No.
I mean, to stop the Houthis, you have to have an air defense system that can stop hypersonic missiles.
Hmm.
And okay, I don't think, but actually, Russia may have that kind of air defense now. Uh, in a video he did earlier today, Larry Johnson pointed out that uh, Russian air defense has now progressed to a system called the S um, um, 550. I thought the most advanced version of their air defense system was the S 500, but Larry says an S 550 exists and it has the capability to shoot down hypersonic missiles. So I might have to take that statement back. So there it is. No brag, just facts. We do our best.
Hmm.
No brag, just facts. Okay. So let's see if we have any comments on that particular jolly post. I consider it a jolly post anyway. I'm going to move my links out of the way here. And I'll share the second of our articles, which is another Larry Johnson piece, a very interesting piece.
Okay.
I was going to do 4 of these today, but at the last minute I decided to do over 3. Actually, this is on Larry Johnson's blog, but the piece is by Alistair Crook. And
Okay.
it's for you, D.
Alrighty. Let me enlarge this. Israel is in moral meltdown. The war to establish a fascist state, quote, the chariots, the chariots of genocide are warming their engines. Israeli law professor Orit Kamir, quote, Israel is flooded with evil, a lack of empathy, and an addiction to hatred and bloodlust.
Says an Israeli law professor.
Yes. The line between Likud and Ben Gvir's Atzma Yehud is increasingly blurred. Netanyahu mocked the families of the kidnapped for the poison machine as early as October 2023. These compilations are drawn from analyst and commentary by Israeli political and security commentators, predominantly published in Hebrew, as reports in Hebrew often provide a different window on Israeli internal discourse. The
Okay.
quote, the chariots of genocide are warming their engines. Gideon Levy of Haaretz. Operation Gideon's Chariots has yet to begin, and the chariots of genocide are already warming their engines. How will we call this massacre, so indiscriminate and pointless, even before the big operation has begun? 23 killed in the bombing of a hospital, one of the most serious war crimes, just to try and kill Mohammed Sinwar, the latest devil with 9 bunker buster bombs. Everything to provide Yehudit Anras in their lust for the main headline. Quote, in his brother's footsteps. The readers loved it. Israelis loved it. No one came out against it. Is there anything left we can do in Gaza that will be seen in Israel as morally and legally unacceptable? 100 dead children, 1,000 women for Sinwar, the brother. It was necessary to eliminate him, they explained, because he was an, quote, obstacle to a hostage deal. We even lost our shame. The sole obstacle to a hostage deal sits in Jerusalem. His name is Benjamin Netanyahu, along with his fascist partners, and no one can even conceive that it's legitimate to harm them to remove the obstacle. What happened on Wednesday in Gaza is just a promo for what will occur in the coming months if no one stops Israel.
Uh, 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 this statement uh, by Gideon uh, 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 Levy, he is perhaps the greatest of all the journalists inside, okay, of Israel. Okay, he's like the Chris Hedges, okay, of Israel. Please go on.
Netanyahu's government has lost control. This was Haaretz editorial 6 May 2025. The decision by the Security Cabinet this week to expand the fighting in the Gaza Strip has a clear meaning. A conscious decision to give up on the hostages, to deepen the humanitarian disaster Israel has brought down on 2 million unprotected civilians in the false hope that it is possible to, quote, relocate them. In other words, a criminal population transfer, and to make the Israeli-Palestinian conflict disappear from the face of the earth. Netanyahu's government has lost control, and it is dragging an entire country into ruin. The new IDF attack on Gaza, war crimes will intensify, Yossi Melman. Defense Minister Katz says the IDF has launched the attack in Gaza. The IDF is preparing for an attack with a force of 5 divisions, about 60,000 soldiers. Most of them are regulars. IDF Chief Zamir is afraid of bringing reservists into Gaza for fear of, quote, white refusal and desertion. So is sending them to other fronts. Humanitarian disaster and destruction and war crimes will intensify, and with them the danger to the hostages. An opinion. Let the IDF mow them down. In Israel, violence saturates everyday life. What does it say about a society that sells A-class, inciting IDF destruction in Gaza, while Palestinian children wait in line at community kitchens, unable to enjoy even one cookie?
Pretty disgusting.
It is disgusting. Images from Haaretz, a row of A-class, oozing cream lined up in a bakery refrigerator, the sweet surface glazed with blue writing. Quote, allow the Israeli army to hit them hard. Or literally, quote, let the IDF mow them down. Assassinating its way to ceasefire by Ronan Bergman. Israeli fighter jets bombarded the southern Gaza city of Khan Yunis on Tuesday evening in an attempt to kill Mohammed Sinwar, one of Hamas's remaining top leaders in the enclave. He is the younger brother of Yahya Sinwar. If the youngest Sinwar has been killed, past experience suggests that Hamas may be less willing to compromise in the short term, while potentially more malleable in the longer term. Mohammed Sinwar is considered one of the main obstacles to a new temporary truce, and his killing could eventually give other Hamas leaders greater leeway to strike a deal. Two of the Israeli defense officials said that by eliminating Sinwar, they hope to remove a particularly intransigent opponent of their conditions for a ceasefire. Yossi Melman, it is clear that if Mohammed Sinwar is eliminated, Hamas will not rush to confirm, if at all, in order to leave Israel in uncertainty and prepared to choose a replacement. But the truth is that even if he is killed, it will be a limited practical achievement. A replacement will be appointed quickly. 1948 was a war to establish a Jewish state. This is a war to establish a fascist state, Gideon Levy Haaretz. The state of Kahan has risen in Israel. Netanyahu's criminal spinelessness made it possible. It wasn't only the neo-Nazi right-wing parties, it was, above all, the Prime Minister's own Likud party that brought Kahanism to power. The profound change that has occurred in Israel is best exemplified by the war in Gaza. Almost everything about it was meant to appease the fascist, racist, pro-population transfer far right, and the spirit of Kahanism seized control of its goals and conduct. Israel is flooded with evil and lack of empathy. Quote, I never knew people were capable of being so evil. Professor Orit Kamir, Haaretz, Hebrew. I have never seen so much evil, so many people eager to express wickedness, competing with each other in demonstrating their closeness and lack of empathy. I never knew people were capable of being so evil, to rejoice in the pain of others, to rejoice when people suffer, starve, die, lose everything they have and die. That is why I have never been so afraid. The feeling is that a mighty dam has been breached, and masses of Israelis are removing all restraints of humanity from themselves and racing to wallow together in toxic hatred, joy in the ego, dehumanization, and violence, as if they were just waiting for the moment when they could free themselves from the rules of etiquette that oblige them to maintain a semblance of morality, which, with shouts of age, they are shedding the conventions and norms that human society has been building for thousands of years to curb the rampage of the ego. They are giving freedom of a new meaning, freedom from the shackles of culture. Equality has been erased from their lexicon, not to mention human dignity, compassion, empathy, loving your neighbor as yourself have been abolished. The new Israeli togetherness is based on an addiction to hatred and bloodlust. None of this happened in an instant, nor on its own. There was someone who had been inciting and poisoning for years, and had built a sophisticated machine to do so systematically. In the list of Netanyahu's crimes against humanity and against Israeli society, stripping many Israelis of all moral inhibitions is one of the most serious, and the highlight. He managed to turn his most terrible failure, the October 7 massacre, into the ultimate excuse that justifies and encourages the new evil Israeliness, like a Pavlovian response implanted through hypnosis. People only need to remember that day and they immediately desire the destruction of Palestinians. And along the way, they are also eager to alienate the kidnapped, attack, attack their families. Netanyahu does not alone bear public responsibility for the horrific disintegration that is taking place before our eyes. He, the members of his government, and the coalition MKs are all openly leading this terrible process. Their fault is complete, and the media that serves them with sickening obedience and performs a mass hypnosis process for them, and anyone who fills or inspires to a leadership position who does not set moral boundaries and does not present an alternative, bears responsibility along with them. In a time in times when a society is losing its moral backbone, as is happening to us now, positive leadership is needed. One moral compass is clear. One whose moral compass is clear and which is not afraid to call evil evil and demand moral behavior. One that does not adopt itself to the murky public mood, but rather points to the human path, the object of life, and calls out, quote, after. Without such leadership, it is hard to believe that a society can extricate itself from the quagmire into which it has sunk. I'm not talking about the Gants and Lapidum, who are incapable of stammering a word of moral leadership. There are no expectations from them. Their moral emptiness is obvious. But even the Eisenkot, on whom desperate Israelis are throwing their love, are filling their mouths with water. Even Golan, who correctly identified the processes a decade ago. Oh yeah, processes a decade ago, refuses to cry out against them today for political reasons. Like Netanyahu, even judges, military personnel, and former gatekeepers who fill platforms and panels and stand firm against the coup d'etat are silent in the face of the moral horror. They too are blinded by the 2 million Gazans who are being expelled, starved, and slaughtered by us incessantly. In the face of organized pogroms backed by the authorities and under the auspices of the security forces in the West Bank. Yehudit Karp, who was the Deputy Attorney General and is crying out against the horror, is an exception that proves the rule. And so are the leaders of the protest who we hoped would emerge as an alternative leadership. Despite the loudness of the Israelis who are racing to the bottom, I am sure that most of us desire life and peace, that we have not renounced humanity. We have been silenced in the face of violence and ugliness, but we are still here. And Ora Kamir is a professor of law and gender at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a visiting professor at the University of Michigan Law School. 10 days left until famine in Gaza. Amos Harel, Haratz Hebrew. In internal discussions within the defense establishment, officials from the Coordination of Operations in the Territories and the Southern Command admit that there are only about 10 days left until a serious crisis erupts, to the point of famine in some areas. Last night it was reported that U.S. Secretary of State Rubio spoke with Netanyahu and expressed the administration's concern about the situation. This is the background to Israel's willingness to relax its stance somewhat in order to allow a partial entry of goods, but the government to distribute food through civilian subcontractors, ostensibly American companies. In practice, it appears that the plan is full of loopholes, especially since behind the scenes, Israeli businesses are involved, who are more interested in potential economic profits than in preventing a mass disaster. And German investigative program exposes Bial's lies and confirms Hamas' desire for a ceasefire dating back to the spring of 2024. Ronan Bergman. New details about the connection between the Prime Minister's office and the German newspaper that was at the center of the secret document leak on Thursday, the Panorama investigation, the leading investigative program on German public television, ARD, that is watched by many millions, aired and included a special report dealing with the affair of the secret connections between the Prime Minister's office, the newspaper, quote, Bild, the publishing house, quote, Axel Springer, to which it belongs. I think you moved up too much.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, to which it belongs, and the leak of the secret document. The Panorama investigation determined that the manner in which the document was presented and its content were seriously distorted, contrary to the claim that it was a document by Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar or something approved by him. It is actually a position paper by Hamas, quote, military intelligence service, written by an unknown operative of the terrorist organization in the spring of 2024. The German broadcasting network stated in the investigation that it had reviewed the original text of the document in complete contrast to what was written in Bild. Quote, from the transcript that Panorama was able to review, it can also be concluded that Hamas is ultimately interested in an agreement with Israel. The document states that flexibility must be shown in the negotiations. The text also shows Hamas' desire for a ceasefire that is as long as possible. The document states that they wanted an 84-day ceasefire, which could be a step towards a complete end to the war. These aspects of the document were not mentioned at all in the Bild article. The line between Likud and Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudit is becoming increasingly blurred by Noah Spiegel. Haaretz. Under Netanyahu's leadership, moderate Likud figures have been pushed out, replaced by nationalist, racist, or inflammatory figures. The competition with Kahan's cock ideological heir, Otzma Yehudit, only reinforced the shift, adopting the ideas and tactics of radical, populist right-wing parties. Otzma Yehudit, headed by Ben-Gvir, is an ideological heir to Meir Kahana's outlawed Koch party. Once shunned across the political spectrum, has seen its views increasingly legitimized in public discourse. By 2025, the difference between the two parties had become difficult to identify, from shared candidates and extreme rhetoric to joint support for racist legislation. Dr. Liran Harsgor of the University of Haifa's School of Political Science agrees that, quote, the ideological and rhetorical boundaries between Likud and Otzma Yehudit have blurred significantly in recent years. Netanyahu's leadership has accelerated this radicalization, Harsgor argues, by prioritizing personal loyalty over ideological moderation. Quote, moderate figures were sidelined and increasingly radical politicians took their place. Candidates who didn't align with Netanyahu's new populist agenda were pushed out, replaced by nationalist, sometimes racist or inflammatory figures, she said. Likud MK Nissim Vettori declared last year that, quote, Gaza should be burned down. There are no innocents left. Likud MK Tali Gottlieb recently added that, quote, there are no uninvolved civilians in Gaza. We must starve them all. These remarks echo Yehudit MK Yitzhak Kreuzer, who said Gaza should be, quote, flattened, and Heritage Minister Makay Eliyahu, who suggested using a nuclear bomb on the Strip. Quote, the Kahanist ideology has replaced the teachings of Jablonski, said Labour MK Gilad Kariv in the Knesset. Quote, Netanyahu's last government is really Ben-Gvir's first. Former Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon, once a senior Likud figure, added that Netanyahu is now aligned with the worldview of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They are acting according to the ideology of Rabbi Dov Lior, a kind of Mein Kampf of Jewish supremacy. The evil Bibiist right is unable to forgive Edon Alexander. Yossi Verta Haaretz Hebrew. The evil Bibiist right is unable to forgive Alexander, a moral and kind-hearted Golani Brigade soldier who came to Israel on his own to enlist and fight, because his freedom involved humiliating their king. They take out their anger on the soldier and his family. Ugliness and evil were not confined to social media. One bully defamed Alexander for the circumstances in which he was taken prisoner, and his mother for not kneeling and thanking Netanyahu. Another commentator on a seemingly more respectable channel chided the prime minister for not sabotaging the government's negotiations with Hamas in a pathetic attempt to prevent the released hostage from traveling to Qatar to be photographed with Trump and Qatari Emir Sheikh Tamim bin Tamad Al Thani. Netanyahu arranged a phone call with Eden in which he, quote, instructed him to obey the doctor's orders. Then he dispatched his humiliated negotiating team to Qatar with their mouths gagged and their hands tied. Witkoff's embrace of Israeli hostage families, Ben Caspid. At Witkoff's highly publicized visit to, to released hostage Edon Alexander in the hospital, he gifted him a Star of David necklace that had belonged to his son Andrew, who died in 2011 at about Alexander's age. It was the necklace worn by his son, who became addicted to painkillers and died in a rehab facility at the age of 22. Those present in the room reported that Witkoff had tears in his eyes. The tragedy of his son's death in his prime had left him with severe personal trauma. He probably saw the coming of Alexander, Andrew's age, as a kind of closing of the circle. Quote, there wasn't a dry eye over this sensitive gesture, and Witkoff sustained embrace of all the hostage families, a close source to Netanyahu told me. Quote, especially given the indifference attributed to Netanyahu himself. Netanyahu's poison machine targeted families of the hostages as early as October 2023. Dr. Rina Anadi, Israeli human rights lawyer. During his long years in power, Netanyahu has established a poison machine that has once had only one purpose: to identify risks to Netanyahu's rule and to dismantle them. Once a risk is identified, it becomes the ultimate goal of the poison machine, and all means are available to dismantle it. With the means including a violent media attack, the imposition of false accusations of serious criminal offenses, false accusations of sexual offenses, continued physical harassment of the person, and harassment of his family members. Publication of personal details of the risk factor and harassment in his home. They do not hesitate to harass family members, including terrorist attacks that have escalated to physical threats and the sending of rifle bullets by soldiers of the criminal organization in power. The real-time program revealed that the poison machine identified the families of the kidnapped as a primary risk factor for the regime for several reasons. This was an event that Israel had never experienced, and the country's citizens were united in the opinion that all the kidnapped must be returned immediately at all cost. In fact, it was not the families of the kidnapped that posed a risk to the government, but rather the immediate solidarity between the citizens of the country and the victims of the massacre and the families of the kidnapped. Therefore, in order to harm his solidarity, the poison machine targeted the families of the kidnapped as early as October 2023, and most of the public. Okay, you moved down.
Did I move too fast? Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. The 4 seconds. Okay, we did that. Remember, they do not hesitate to harass family members, including terrorist acts that have escalated to physical threats and the sending of rifle bullets by soldiers of the criminal organizations in power. The real-time program revealed that Poison Machine identified the families of the kidnapped as a primary risk factor for the regime for several reasons. This was an event that Israel had never experienced, and the country's citizens were united in the opinion that all the kidnapped must be returned immediately and at all cost. In fact, it was not the families of the kidnapped that posed a risk to the government, but rather the immediate solidarity between the citizens of the country and the victims of the massacre and the families of the kidnapped. Therefore, in order to harm this solidarity, the poison machine targeted the families of the kidnapped as early as October 2023, when most of the public was in shock from the massacre. Netanyahu mocked them for the poison machine, and the operators of the poison machine did not need too many clues to understand who the target was and how to dismantle it. They began a campaign against them. The violent thugs on the ground began to come to the abductees' camp to dance, rejoice, blaspheme, curse, and rejoice for the sake of others. Quote, senior commentators from the right, of course, have already begun to claim that the families of the abductees are weakening Israel and contributed to strengthening Hamas's position, and in fact harming the return of the abductees. There is no doubt that what was done to the family members of the kidnapped breaks all the poison records. It is a serious crime in itself. When we bring the gang members to justice for their responsibility for the massacre and its desolation, one of the most serious charges is the way they turned the families of the kidnapped into enemies. The poison machine was already operating at full capacity in October 2023, and the criminals in power who operated it must be held accountable. Netanyahu's ongoing corruption trial is a farce. Baruch Kara Walla. Instead of a proper legal process that uncovers the truth, there is a loose spectacle in which an accused prime minister runs the courtroom and judges hesitate to enforce the rules. Extraordinary privileges, political speeches, and turning a blind eye make the Netanyahu trial a painful example of the erosion of the foundations of equality before the law. It's better to say it clearly, simply, without too many dirty words. Netanyahu's trial is a farce. It is not a trial that upholds the principle of equality before the law. It is a circus. It is a stage for speeches instead of a stage for clarifying the truth. It is an embarrassing demonstration of judges who are conducting this trial with a weak hand, with stuttering, with a lack of confidence, with volatility. The media coup is reaching the implementation stage. Israeli Channel Forum Joint Emergency Declaration. Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister of Communications Kare are promoting a legislative process to take over the media in Israel. Contrary to declarations and under the guise of, quote, transferring power to the consumer, power is being transferred to the government. Israeli Channels Forum, Khan 11, Keshet 12, and Reshet 13 is publishing a joint emergency declaration this evening, following the publication of the, quote, reform by Minister Kare, which will be brought to a vote in the Knesset in the current session. Quote, the moment we warned about has arrived. This coming Sunday, Netanyahu and the Communications Minister Kare intend to pass a rapid legislative measure aimed at taking control of the media in Israel. Kare's plan to take over the free media consists of a series of dangerous components: the cancellation of public broadcasting, IDF Radio, and the Khan Broadcasting Corporation, legislation that gives the government political control, sanctions and fines in order to deter criticism or lead to the closure of investigative media outlets. The plan will be promoted in parallel with private legislation, which has already been launched in the Knesset, a draconian law that seeks to undermine the economic foundation of free television and transfer it to political control. We call on the gatekeepers, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Justice, and all the parties involved to stand firm and stop the dangerous move that threatens to crush the foundations of free media and harm democracy in Israel. Citizens abandon Israel. Since October 7th of 2023, many Israeli citizens have left, not for a trip, not for relocation with a tempting contract, but out of despair, fear, and a sense of alienation and distrust in a country that has ceased to function as a safe haven for the Jewish people and a home for its citizens. The hard data leaves no room for doubt. We are in the midst of an exceptional wave of immigration, unprecedented in its scale and timing. According to CBS data and analysis published in Ynet, Mako, and The Marker, in 2023, 55,300 Israelis left Israel, while only 27,800 returned, a negative balance of about 27,500 people. In October 2023 alone, the month the war broke out, 12,350 people left, an increase of 285,000 compared to October of 2022. In 2024, according to current projections, 82,700 residents left, and only 23,800 returned, a negative migration balance of about 58,900. These numbers don't just dance in the red, they scream. The migration cannot be attributed solely to the security situation. Many of those leaving cite radicalization as a key factor. The political, the violation of the rule of law, the internal divisions, and the government's failure to provide personal and economic security. Under a government that races along ideologically blinding and abandons the public, many Israelis have simply thrown up their hands. These are not lazy or cowardly people, but educated people, high-tech people, doctors, teachers, students, young couples, and families. Those who were supposed to hold Israel's society together are fleeing it. Immigration is a profound measure of a sense of belonging. When Israelis leave, not just because of physical danger, but because they feel they no longer have a place here, The country needs to stop everything and ask itself what went wrong.
Well, that is quite a picture that was painted by this particular post. It speaks of a country that is falling apart.
Right, and even before October 2023, we had read articles where people were leaving, and a lot of the secular Jews were leaving. A lot of people, they had a problem with the right wing shift and just felt that freedom of expression, a lot of the freedoms were, they felt a danger, a freedom of expression. There was just this sense where people kind of, people stuck to their own neighborhoods, the people that are familiar with whatever. People weren't like getting in everybody's faces. Yeah, this right wing just trying to change things in society, and that's where a lot of people were leaving.
Yes, but I think all these remarks here have a cumulative effect so that it's all stunning. Okay, it's just all, uh, I mean, these people are horrified and still living there and still working there, trying to do something while they're living in the midst of a moral horror, of
Mm-hmm.
uh, moral bankruptcy.
Oh, it is.
It's just that it was just a stunning piece. Okay, I think.
Yes. Yeah, and I posted some of those articles on my timeline that we had read with Haaretz, because I go on there every day and look to see what's happening and their perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, that they've been trying so hard to educate people, let
Yes,
people really see the full picture.
they have. They have. Okay. And still, Israel goes deeper and deeper and deeper into the moral ditch, deeper and deeper into the moral quicksand. I don't know where it's going to end. Okay, I really don't. I, I fear it's going to end with the, and I don't even know if I fear this. Uh, it might be the best thing to happen if there were a dissolution of that state. The evil it has brought is so great.
Hmm.
Evelina says, is Israel comparing itself to the Romans, which the chariots come to mind? Saw a video today of an elderly Palestinian man weeping. He had not eaten in 3 days. Cannot describe my indignation, not to mention the heartbreak. Yes, Evelina, thank you for that comment. And thanks to Larry Johnson for publishing that.
Hmm.
It really needed to be more widely circulated than just the conflict forum blog of Alistair Crook.
Right, and really showing this is, Israeli media. This is coming from Israel. It's not the outside saying something.
Yes, right. It's Israeli media. It's written, okay, in Hebrew, and it's their view
Hmm.
is happening. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Maybe our spirits will lift a little bit with that run. This is another one by Larry C. Johnson from Sonar 21. Trump calls Putin, the game remains the same. There's Trump and Putin. Donald Trump is refusing to follow the Zelensky European script for trapping Russia.
Okay, you need to put this in the room.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
I think I was thrown off by the previous blog. Donald Trump is refusing to follow the Zelensky European script for trapping Russia. The leaders of the UK, France, Germany, and Poland made a desperate effort to get Trump to demand Russia accept an unconditional 30-day ceasefire or face a new round of bone-crushing sanctions. Zelensky, like the trained
Mm-hmm.
monkey he is, repeated this mantra. Trump did not take the bait. Presidents Trump and Putin spoke for about 2 hours on Monday, May 19th. Trump used a big tube of lipstick to describe the conversation. President Trump characterized the conversation as excellent, quote unquote, announcing that Russia and Ukraine um, would immediately begin uh, um, uh, um, but uh, negotiations toward a ceasefire and an end to the war. He proposed the Vatican as a potential host for these talks and indicated the U.S. Would not be mediating, asserting that only the two countries understand the nuances of the conflict. The Kremlin provided a more accurate account. According to the readout of the Kremlin, Putin described the call as, quote, frank and substantive, unquote, expressing Russia's readiness to work with Ukraine on drafting a memorandum for future peace talks. However, he declined to support the U.S. proposed 30-day unconditional ceasefire, emphasizing that any ceasefire would require prior agreement on various unresolved issues. Putin reiterated Russia's core demands, including the demilitarization of Ukraine and limitations on Western influence, stating that these objectives remain unchanged. He suggested that a ceasefire could only be possible if numerous open questions were addressed beforehand. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, Putin did not budge 1 inch in the Russian position he presented on the 14th of June, 2024. This is consistent with Russia's presentation to the Ukrainian delegation last Friday in Istanbul. Russia's lead negotiator Vladimir Medinsky asserted that talks could proceed concurrently with ongoing military operations. He emphasized that Russia was prepared to continue the conflict as long as necessary to achieve its objectives, referencing historical precedents such as the Great Northern War, which lasted for 21 years at the end of the 17th century, and the beginning of the 18th century. The leader of Russia during that war, of course, was Peter the Great. And Vladimir Medinsky reportedly stated, quote, we are ready to fight forever, unquote, highlighting Russia's readiness for a prolonged conference. Uh, um, 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 but Vladimir Medinsky is not gaslighting. His words reflect the thinking of Putin and the Russian General Staff. The unanswered question is whether or not Trump and his national security team understand that Russia is not staking out a faux negotiation posture, i.e., presenting a tough demand but are willing to make concessions The answer is no. I had my usual Monday morning chats with Nima and the judge, Judge Napolitano. These were recorded while Putin and Trump were conversing, so I did not have the information to discuss what was said. However, I was able to discuss the Russian position and the failure of Trump and his team to listen to what Putin, Lavrov, and other Russian officials have repeatedly stated uh, uh, during the past 11 months. And there's the link to the video there, and the link to the Judging Freedom video also. So, what Larry here is basically saying is that there was no change in any positions as a result of the call. The personal vibrations in the call may have been very positive,
Mm-hmm.
but Russia sticks firmly to its position. And if Trump wants peace, he is going to have to accept that. And accepting that, in my view, involves going further than just a 2-hour phone call, okay, with Putin. Trump is going to have to wash his hands, okay, of Ukraine, stop supporting the ongoing war, and allow Russia and Ukraine to settle it. Of course, if that happens, Trump will be charged, with losing Ukraine uh, uh, to Russia, and he'll be charged with somehow betraying the United States. But what he really will be doing is uh, changing the posture of the United States. It will be another step towards the acceptance of a multipolar world, understanding that Russia uh, has the right to protect its national security, against attacks by the West. Uh, the whole business, okay, with Ukraine, was an attempt by the West to use Ukraine as a battering ram to actually break up Russia, to break up the Federation. And the battering ram was in process, okay, of development from 1994 on. It was a long-term process to create an instrument that could actually threaten Russia. And it was part of a larger process of creating a NATO that could actually threaten Russia. And what Putin has done here, over a period of years, is he has brought up short, okay, this effort. He has destroyed the integrity of the effort and the possibility of success of the effort. And he's making uh, he's creating a situation where the United States is forced to accept that Russia will not be broken up, that it will continue to be a great power, one of the great powers of the world, and that if the United States wants to live in peace with that particular great power, then the United States and its instruments, okay, including NATO, is going to have to get out of Russia's face, is going to have to allow the creation of a buffer zone of neutral nations between Russia, and the West. We're seeing that process actually occurring now, but whether we'll actually see Trump bring this war to an end by stopping support of Ukraine is still in question. Still is in question. I think the next 2 weeks will be critical. Is Trump going to go the whole way? If he doesn't go the whole way, then I think that Russia will cease talking to him. Because at this point, what Russia is doing is demanding seriousness on the part of Trump. And serious means that we have to abandon the long-term attempt that we were engaged in to break up the Federation. Anyway, that's the way I see it. Have you any comments?
No, not right now.
Okay. Earl of Lurl says, after 9/11, U.S. switched from soft power to any power. Afghanistan and Iraq were just expeditionary invasions. Ukraine puts us on a nuclear precipice, and Gaza has pushed us over a genocidal cliff. Well, yes, I think that is a very good characterization of what has gone on, Earl. I quite agree with it. Okay, let's get to the next of our pieces tonight.
Okay.
Joe.
Yes. Thank you, honey. I will share the screen for a very good piece by Mike Whitney. This came from the Unz Review, where we get so many of the excellent articles we go through here.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Dee.
Okay. Rethinking U.S.-China relations after the tariffs shipwreck. Mike Whitney, May 18th, 2025. We pay 20% on stuff from China. What? Tariff war. Yes. How we pay 30% on stuff from China. Trump 2028. Crazy. When President Trump imposed his sweeping tariffs on April 2nd, he had two main objectives: reduce the trade deficits and bring jobs and manufacturing back to the United States. These were the stated goals, but as we soon found out, the real aim was to weaken China by preventing them from selling goods to U.S. consumers. The Trump administration also used the tariffs to isolate China by providing incentives to the nations that agreed to reduce their trade with Beijing. In short, the tariffs were the main weapon in a trade war on a peer competitor who has overtaken the U.S. in nearly every area of industrial and technological production.
I think that characterization is a very good one of what has gone on.
hmm
Please continue.
Fortunately, Trump's plan failed, and he was forced to ease the tariffs without achieving any of his main objectives. The reason we say, quote, fortunately, is because the tariff policy never served the interest of the American people. Quite the contrary, Americans are hurt by unilateral policies that ignore the rules of international trade and needlessly disrupt supply chains. All that does is push prices higher, reduce employment, and slow growth. Besides, manipulating tariffs with the intention of destroying a rival violates a number of widely accepted World Trade Organization rules that protect the interests of everyone. In contrast to the US, China acted in a way that was consistent with their broader social philosophy, which is rooted in their unique interpretation of socialism. They took the moral high ground, acted on principle, and refused to give in to Trump's coercion. They only initiated countermeasures in response to Trump's tariffs blitz that completely ignored the rules articulated in the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade (GATT), which stipulates that countries cannot arbitrarily exceed "bound rates" or selectively target one country with 145% tariffs, which is the equivalent of an embargo. By acting alone, Trump basically showed his contempt for their international system and for any legal constraints on his own power. This is from the Global Times.
Yeah, boy, isn't that last a surprise?
Hmm
A great surprise. Please go on.
I just have to read the multinational, the multilateral trading system with the World Trade Organization as its core is the cornerstone of international trade and plays an important role in global economic governance. All parties should resolve differences and disputes through equal-footed dialogue under the framework of the WTO, jointly uphold multilateralism and free trade, and promote the stability and smooth functioning of global industrial and supply chains. And here, China more popular than the U.S. in global survey of 100 nations.
Wow, isn't that interesting?
Yes.
It's interesting that Russia is minus 9%,
hmm
but the US is minus 5%. China is plus 14%.
hmm China's Qi is, quote, least disliked out of the four figures.
Yes. Okay, the other point to note in this graph is the US began at 20% in 2022
hmm
and has now fallen in 2025 to minus 5%.
Right.
And China began at something less than 0%, in other words, was negative, and it has risen to plus 14%. And Russia began at what looks like about minus 30% and now has gone up to minus 9%.
hmm
So this is very interesting. The four figures are Donald Trump, Putin, Elon Musk, and Xi Jinping. Of those figures, Donald Trump is the highest when it comes to negatives. He's at 58%, negative, 15% of neutral, and 27% are positive with respect to Donald Trump.
hmm
Putin is positive at 32%, 19% are neutral, and 49%, okay, are negative. Elon Musk is 31% up, up, positive, so not quite as popular as Putin. 20,
Lex, I'm sorry.
27% okay is neutral, and 42% okay is negative for Musk. Okay, this was April 9th to 23, 2025. Okay, the study had 111,273 respondents across 100 countries. The most popular figure was actually, all told, or at least maybe I should say the least unpopular figure, it was Xi Jinping, 32% positive, which equals Putin, but 37% are neutral, not aware. Let's put it that way. The negatives of Xi Jinping are only 31%, way below the negatives of Elon Musk at 42%, Putin at 49%, and Donald Trump at 58%.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, please
In
go.
in other words, Trump's loss was a victory for the system of international trade, but it was also a victory for China because China's quote stuck it to its guns and refused to bow down to Washington's bullying. Here's more from Bloomberg. Xi Jinping's decision to stand his ground against Donald Trump could hardly have gone any better for the Chinese leader. After 2 days of high stakes talks in Switzerland, trade negotiators from the world's biggest economies announced Monday a massive de escalation in tariffs. In a clearly coordinated joint statement, the U.S. slashed duties on Chinese products to 30% from 145% for a 90-day period, while Beijing dropped its levy on most goods to 10%. The dramatic reduction exceeded expectations in China and sent the dollar and stocks soaring, providing some much needed market relief for Trump, who is facing pressure as inflation looks set to speed up at home. Chinese equities also surged. The deal ended up meeting nearly all of Beijing's core demands. The elevated reciprocal tariff for China, which Trump set at 34% on April 2nd, has been suspended, leaving America's top rival with the same 10% rate that applies to the UK, a longtime ally.
Okay, I find the last two paragraphs to be somewhat in contradiction to each other,
Mm-hmm.
because in the first paragraph it says the U.S. slashed duties on Chinese products to 30% from the 145%.
Right.
But in the second one, it says that the tariffs, which Trump said at 34% on April 2nd, have been suspended, and that China now has the same 10% rate, okay, that applies to the UK. So is the tariff at 30% or is it at uh, at 10%? I also have to point out that a tariff of 30% is higher than uh, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, okay, in 1929, which was a big trigger for the depression, okay, the 1930s. A 30% tariff is
Mm-hmm.
very, very high. And in the context of our discussion of rare earths, okay, on Saturday, what do we gain from having a tariff of 30% on rare earths imported from China? Okay, in other words, that mine in California,
Mm-hmm.
that mines the rare earths, okay, is going to go to China with a tariff on it, okay, of 10%. Okay, so the Chinese are going to let it in with a tariff of 10%. I don't see
Mm-hmm.
why they want to put any tariff on that at all. Okay, but then they're going to produce the elements from the rare earths for us, and we're going to have to buy them because those elements are essential for our military sector and for certain other key industrial products, and we're going to have to pay a tariff of 30%. I mean, does that help us?
Right.
I mean, this is really ridiculous, silly, and dangerous, and inflationary to boot.
This is arguably the best outcome that China could have hoped for. The U.S. backed down, said Trey McGarver, co-founder of research firm Trivium China. Quote, going forward, this will make the Chinese side confident that they have leverage over the U.S. in any negotiations. That was Swiss info. Repeat, this is the best outcome that China could have hoped for. The U.S. backed down. China won trade war, even U.S. commentators admit it. 145% was a de facto trade barrier, now demolished. I won. No, you didn't. U.S. policy towards China is not only deeply immoral, it is counterproductive. Anyone who followed recent events in the foreign press understands that the United States hurt itself very badly by its bully boy tactics. What people outside the United States saw was an aging and enfeebled prizefighter enter the ring with a ferocious young contender who knocked him out in the first round. In less than 6 weeks, Trump removed the bulk of the tariffs, leaving just 30% in order to save face with his backers. In exchange, he got nothing from China at all. Beijing made no concessions other than allowing Trump to increase the tariff on Chinese imports from 20 to 30%, which means that the blue-collar men and women who are Trump's most ardent supporters will pay an additional 10% at their favorite department store. So while Trump promises massive new tax cuts for the uber wealthy, working people just saw their taxes hiked by a whopping 10%. Here's more from The Guardian.
Right.
Yes.
So before we move to the Guardian, I just want to make the point. I was thinking about the rare earths thing again. So the rare earths go to China, and they put a tariff of 10% on it, which raises the cost, okay, of the rare earths. Then the rare earths, okay, are processed, okay, and then they come back to the United States with the processing charges on them, uh, with the profits on them. And then on top of that, we put a 30% tariff on elements extracted from, okay, the rare earths that we can't get easily in any other place. So all of the rigmarole here has raised the price of things by 40%, plus the profits which the Chinese make from the extraction. I mean, so what have we done? I mean, it makes no sense. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Donald Trump will inevitably claim Monday's temporary truce in the U.S. China trade war as a victory, but financial markets seem to have read it for what it is, a capitulation. In other words, the president has caved. He may have been swayed by market wobbles, but it seems more plausible that dire warnings from retailers about emptying shelves, backed up by the data showing shipments into the U.S. ports collapsing, may have strengthened the hands of trade moderates in the administration. Confronted with the warnings of a shortage of toys, Trump told reporters that children should be happy with, quote, $2 instead of 30, and they might, quote, cost a couple of bucks more than usual. But it's difficult to imagine even this more bullish of presidents with withstanding the attacks that would come his way if he began to be seen as responsible for COVID-style shortages of key goods in the world's largest economy. Instead, the White House seems to have opted for tactical retreat. The China-US conflict was always the hottest theater of confrontation in Trump's trade war, with a longer history and deeper public support than his quixotic attacks on Mexico and Canada. If Trump is indeed ready to give in, even with Beijing, it sends signals that some of the other aggressive aspects of this trade policy may be negotiable. Yes, Trump might claim China victory, but it wasn't. As far as Trump's stated goals to reduce the trade deficits and bring jobs and manufacturing back to the U.S., the president failed on both counts. But in respect to his insatiated goals, or unstated goals, weakening and isolating China, he also failed. And the reason he failed is due to three things. One, China was able to maintain global trade flows through diversification. They found other buyers for U.S. bound exports. Two, China responded to the need for fiscal stimulus and government intervention quickly, which maintained their growth targets. Three, China was able to inflict serious pain on the U.S. by withholding its exports, which left ports on the West Coast in deep distress. What China achieved is as close to complete victory as one could imagine. Even so, the equities markets skyrocketed shortly after a settlement was announced, which is why no one seems to care about Trump's embarrassing miscue. China more popular than the US in most countries polled. The map compares the popularity of the US and China in each country based on their net perception score, measured as the difference between the share of respondents with a positive perception minus those with a negative perception of each country. The country with the highest net score is relatively more popular or less unpopular. China is more popular, you see all the red, and US more popular in the green.
Right. So China is much more popular
Yes.
across the world.
Hmm.
Okay, but uh, in India, which has the largest population in the world, okay, the U.S. is more popular.
Hmm.
Okay, and in Brazil, uh, also the U.S. is more popular. Another big population area. Uh, anyway, just pointing it out. Please go.
One one of the oddities of the tariffs dust-up was the fact that the Trump team never anticipated China's retaliatory response. It's actually amazing. The administration lives in such an information bubble that they thought China would cave in after their comical, quote, Liberation Day announcement. What were they thinking? We know that Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent was thinking because he made a number of public statements that the U.S. had an edge on China because we were the okay, you moved too fast.
Sorry.
Because we were the deficit country. Here's what he said in an interview on CNN and SNBC. Quote, we are the deficit country. They sell almost 5 times more goods to us than we sell to them. So the onus will be on them to take off these tariffs. They're unsustainable for them. He cited estimates that China could lose 5 to 10 million jobs if tariffs persist, highlighting China's economic vulnerability. This is idiocy. This is like saying that the ragamuffin panhandler on the street corner has the advantage over the flush businessman with millions in the bank. The US is 36 trillion in debt while China has a 3 trillion surplus. How does being broke give us the advantage? We're lucky that China still accepts our currency at all. And yet, our Treasury Secretary thinks that being destitute gives us the upper hand. A man like this should not be Treasury Secretary. He has shown repeatedly that he doesn't have the foggiest idea of how the economy works or what policies will help to advance American interest. He is grok on Besant. Besant's public statements reflect a strategic focus on the U.S.'s deficit position as a negotiating advantage, supported by China's economic vulnerabilities and the eventual Geneva deal. However, China's export shift to Southeast Asia, transshipment tactics, and domestic economic resilience suggest he underestimated Beijing's ability to weather tariffs, limiting the U.S.'s edge. Both sides faced costs, but China's adaptability meant the deficit advantage was less decisive than Besant claimed. That is a rather long-winded way of saying that Besant was wrong about everything. We should all be grateful that Trump gave up on his quote tariff strategy before it inflicted even more damage on the US economy. We can only hope that he will reflect on what has transpired in the last few weeks and seriously reconsider Washington's self-defeating relations with China. The consensus view among Western elites, media, and the entire political class is that China's rise represents a grave threat to the America's privileged position in the world order. It is this misguided assumption that shapes U.S. policy on China and puts us on a course for a military confrontation. We must eradicate this destructive idea at its roots and look for a constructive way that we can work with China on projects that help to improve security, increase prosperity, and end war. China is not our enemy, and they do not seek a confrontation with the United States. What China wants is what most ordinary Americans want: peace, security, and a human community with a shared future in an open, inclusive, clean, and beautiful world. Those are the words of China's Premier Xi Jinping. His sentiments may seem familiar to older readers who may recall the equally powerful words of President John F. Kennedy, who said, quote, "For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." And there's a YouTube clip, uh, John F. Kennedy's commencement address.
Yeah, the famous one at American University,
Hmm.
and the painting of John F. Kennedy.
Hmm.
Well, I thought that was a terrific piece.
I thought so too.
Okay, in general, the only issue I would take with it is when he starts talking about the deficits.
Yes.
He says, uh, first of all, Scott Bessent, okay, is ambiguous when he says we are the deficit country. He seems to be talking about the trade deficit here. So because they sell almost 5 times more than we sell to them, the onus will be on them to take off uh, these tariffs.
Hmm.
Okay, but it was not them who was putting on the tariffs in the first place. It was we putting the tariffs on, on their goods.
Right.
Okay, uh, so uh, in a sense, it's we that's cutting off the trade. Okay, but it also assumed that China could not find other buyers for their goods. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
in other words, it neglected the issue of the possibility of a replacement of customers. Okay, and that was not bright. It's true. But it has nothing to do with the idea of a ragamuffin panhandler on the street corner having an advantage over the businessman who is flush, with millions in the bank. We have $36 trillion in debt, and China may have a surplus of 3 trillion, but that doesn't have anything necessarily to do with the trade deficit. In other words, there, what we're talking about is a fiscal surplus, as opposed to, a fiscal debt.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The surplus in China has the effect of taking money out of the non government sector. This is not a particular advantage to China. Okay. The 36 trillion in debt that we have means that we have placed $36 trillion into the non government sector, thereby making the non government sector very prosperous. Okay, China has also made its non government sector very prosperous, uh, but it has done this, okay, in other ways, not by running very large deficits on the part of the government. So I'm not following the reasoning here in that particular paragraph. I don't think Mike Whitney understands that from the sectoral balance point of view, I don't think he understands the significance of a very large debt in terms of creating the possibility of your population being able to buy lots and lots of goods, okay, in the international system.
Mm-hmm.
The money is there to buy those goods. So, and I think that his idea that we are broke because we are $36 trillion in debt is foolish. Okay? The government is not broke because it's $36 trillion in debt, in spite of all the propaganda from the Austerians, from the Republican side, and from some very foolish people, in the Democratic Party. Uh, $36 trillion in debt has no negative implications for fiscal sustainability. So uh, I think that paragraph, okay, is nonsense. China was able to sustain itself in terms of the tariff war because it could shift, okay, its exports to Southeast Asia. It could do transshipments, and it was, of course, strong enough that it could begin to run deficits in terms of its own country in order to increase domestic consumer demand, to try to compensate uh, uh, for the loss of foreign trade. It had been meaning for some time to increase the domestic consumption demand. In a certain way, it had been following austerity policies, with respect to domestic markets for a long time. So shifting demand over to the domestic arena by running fiscal deficits in China is actually going to make them even stronger. But anyway, this is a subject for discussion at some later time. Other than that, I found this article to be very, very good. So let's see if we have uh, any comments. I don't think we have any comments on it. So let us go on to our next piece, unless you have some comments on the tariff piece, D.
No, I thought it was well explained.
Okay, very good.
You know, yeah, it was very good, I thought.
Okay. Yeah, I think Mike Whitney is a very good writer. I respect his stuff a great deal. We've done quite a number of his blogs already here. They always seem to be very relevant. So, uh, we have another piece from Alistair Crook here. Okay, this time directly under the banner of UN's review. Uh, and, the author is Alistair Crook. The title is, quote, Transition, unquote, to a New World Order up, up, is beyond most in the West. This was done on May 19th, 2025, by Alistair Crook. And there's a picture of a picture of the dollar with a swirl in it. I suppose the swirl is there to represent the relative chaos we see. The caption says the new era marks the end to old politics, red versus blue, right versus left, and labels are losing their relevance. Even the need for transition, just to be clear, has only just begun to be recognized in the United States. For the European leadership, however, and for the beneficiaries of financialization, who haughtily lament Trump's, quote, storm, unquote, unwisely unleashed on the world, his base economic theses are ridiculed as bizarre notions completely divorced from economic, uh, quote, uh, 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 reality, unquote. That is completely untrue. For as Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis, who is one of the world's great economists, points out, the reality of the Western situation and the need for transition is clearly spelled out by Paul Volcker, Volcker, the correct spelling, former chair of the Federal Reserve as long ago as 2005. Of course, he was no longer the chair of the Fed in 2005. If I recall correctly, it was Greenspan who was still the
Hmm.
Fed chair in 2005. The harsh fact, quote unquote, of the liberal globalist economic paradigm was evident even then. Quote, what holds together the globalist system is a massive and growing flow of capital from abroad, running to more than $2 billion every working day and growing. There's no sense of strain. As a nation, we don't consciously borrow or beg. We aren't even offering attractive interest rates. Nor do we have to offer our creditors protection against the risk of declining dollar. Yeah, very true. Quote again, it is all quite comfortable for us. We fill our shops and garages with goods from abroad, and the competition has been a powerful restraint on our internal prices. It surely helped to keep interest rates exceptionally low, despite our vanishing savings and rapid growth, unquote. Quote again, and it's been comfortable for our trading partners too, and for those supplying the capital. Some, such as China and Europe, particularly Germany, have depended heavily on our expanding domestic markets. And for the most part, the central banks of the emerging world have been willing to hold more and more dollars, which are, after all, the closest thing the world has to a truly international currency, unquote. Uh, the difficulty, quote again, the difficulty is that this seemingly comfortable pattern can't go on indefinitely, unquote. And Alistair says, precisely. And Trump has in the process of blowing up the world trading system so as to reset it. Those Western liberals who today are gnashing teeth and lamenting the advent of, quote, Trumpian economics, unquote, are simply in denial that Trump has at least recognized the most important American reality, i.e., that the pattern can't go on indefinitely and that debt-led consumerism is way past its sell-by date. He says debt-led consumerism. Well, there's an ambiguity here too, because the reference until now has been to government debt, but it's also true that private
True.
sector debt here in the United States, okay, is very, very high, and that our consumerism is based on debt as well, on people going into debt here. Are you about to say something, Dee?
Oh no, it was just something here.
Okay. Recall that most participants in the Western financial system have known nothing other than Volcker's, quote, comfortable world, unquote, their entire life. No wonder they have difficulty thinking outside their sealed retort. That does not mean, of course, that Trump's solution to the problem will work. Possibly Trump's particular form of structural rebalancing could make matters actually worse. Yeah, I think we're seeing that from Mike Whitney already. Nonetheless, restructuring in some form clearly is inevitable. It comes down otherwise to a choice between bankruptcy, slow or fast, okay, and also disorderly. Bankruptcy? The U.S. cannot go bankrupt. So, the notion of bankruptcy that Alistair has in mind here would have to be clarified. Okay, the dollar-led globalist system worked well initially, at least from the U.S. perspective. The U.S. exported its post-World War II manufacturing overcapacity to a newly dollarized Europe, who consumed the surplus, and Europe too enjoyed the benefit of having its macroeconomic environment, export-led models, guaranteed by the U.S. market. I think that paragraph is a good analysis. The present crisis began, however, when the paradigm inverted, when the U.S. entered on its era of unsustainable structural budget deficits. Well, of course, that's not true because the budget deficits are sustainable. And when financialization, they're completely sustainable because we're a monetary sovereign. So Alistair has that part of it wrong. And when financialization led Wall Street to build its inverted pyramid of derivative assets, resting upon a tiny pivot of real assets. Now, the second part of that paragraph, he has right, I think. I think the inverted pyramid of derivative assets was a very serious cause of the crash of 2008 and the following years. The raw fact of the structural imbalance crisis is bad enough, but the Western geostrategic crisis goes much deeper than just the structural contradiction of inward capital flows and a, quote, strong, unquote, dollar eating the heart out of the U.S. manufacturing sector, because it is bound up too with the concomitant collapse of core ideologies uh, 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 underpinning uh, the doctrines of liberal globalism. It is because of this Western deep devotion to ideology, as well as to the Volcker, and here Volcker is spelled incorrectly without the C, comfort, quote unquote, provided by the system, that has triggered such a torrent of anger and outright derision towards Trump's, quote, rebalancing plans. Yes, I think I agree with that. The deep devotion to free trade, which is not near as good a doctrine as either fair trade or trade in order to fulfill the public purpose. Uh, Barely a Western economist has a good word to say, and yet no plausible alternative framework is offered. Their passion directed at Trump simply underlines that Western economic theory is bankrupt. Two, I have a plausible alternative framework to offer. It was offered in my book, Who Needs Balanced Budgets? Who Needs Balanced Trade and Who Needs Balanced Budgets? So I commend that to you if you're interested in looking at an alternative framework, okay, to that of globalism, of neoliberal ideology, which is to say that the deeper geostrategic crisis in the West consists in both the collapse of archetypal ideology and a paralytic elite order. For 30 years, Wall Street sold a fantasy. Debt didn't matter, and I still believe that government debt in the United States does not matter. And that illusion just shattered. I don't know why that illusion shattered. Uh, by the way, private debt does matter very much. Okay, if private debt is too high, why does it matter so much? Because the private sector can't create any net financial assets. The government, of course, uh, can create money without actually creating corresponding debt. It doesn't do that now, but it can do that. And that's why the debt of government doesn't matter for fiscal sustainability. Yet some understand that the Western economic paradigm of debt-led hyper-financialized consumerism has run its course, and the change, is um, 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 inevitable. But so heavily invested is the West in the Anglo-economic model that for the most part the economists stay paralyzed in the spider's web. There is no alternative is the watch phrase. Well, I think that statement is very um, um, ironic because Tina is the watch phrase for neoliberalism. And it's the watch phrase also for austerity, in government budgeting, which is one implication of what Alistair is talking about here. The ideological spine to the U.S. economic model lies firstly with Friedrich von Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Yes, I agree with that, which is understood to mean that any government involvement in the management of the economy was an infringement of liberty and tantamount to socialism. And then, secondly, following the Hayekian union with the Chicago School of Monetarism, in the person of Milton Friedman, who would pen the American edition of The Road to Serfdom, which ironically came to be called Capitalism and Freedom, the archetype was set. Economist Phil Pilkington, who, by the way, is economist. I wouldn't characterize him as an MMTer necessarily, because I don't know where he's gone with his latest writings, but in the 2010 to 2013 period, he certainly was, an MMT economist. Bonnie has something. Oh yeah, Bonnie is reminding me to tell you that my book that I recently spoke of is available, okay, at Amazon. It's a Kindle book, okay, as are all of the MMT books that I've done. There are 7 such books, but the book I referred to before, okay, is under my authorship, okay, at Amazon, and you can buy the Kindle copies for $9.99. All you have to do is go to Amazon, okay, and order them. Economist Phil Pilkington writes that Hayek's delusion that markets equal freedom and were therefore consonant with the deeply embedded American libertarian current, quote, has become widespread to the point of all discourse being completely saturated, unquote. And quote again, and this is, I guess, another quote from Phil Pilkington. In polite company in public, you can certainly be left wing or right wing, but you will always be in some shape or form neoliberal. Otherwise, you will simply be not allowed entry to discourse. Now, that is quote unquote. Now, that has changed somewhat because of the success of the MMTers over the years, and particularly the great success of Stephanie Kelton's book, uh, 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 which is not at all neoliberal. Quote, each country may have its own peculiarities, but on broad principles, they follow a similar pattern. Debt-led neoliberalism is, first and foremost, the theory of how to re-engineer the state in order to guarantee the success of markets and its most important participant, modern corporations. Unquote. So here is the fundamental point. The crisis of liberal globalism is not just a matter of rebalancing a failing structure. Imbalance always is inevitable, where all economies similarly pursue altogether, all at once, the export-led, open Anglo model. No, the bigger problem is that the archetypal myth of individuals and oligarchs pursuing their own separate and individual utility maximization, thanks to the hidden hand of market magic, is such that in aggregate their combined efforts will be to the benefit of the community as a whole. Adam Smith has collapsed too. Effectively, to the ideology to which the West clings so tenaciously, that human motivation is utilitarian and only utilitarian, is a delusion. Of course, I completely agree with that. As philosophers of science like Hans Albert have pointed out, the theory of utility maximization rules out real world mapping a priori, thus rendering the theory um, um, you know, um, um, untestable. And theories that are untestable, of course, as we know, okay, are unscientific. Okay. When you're first formulating theories that are abstract, it's kind of expected they might not be testable at first. But if you never expose them to testing, that is unscientific. Paradoxically, Trump nonetheless is, of course, the chief of all utilitarian maximizers. Is he then the prophet of a return to the era of swashbuckling American tycoons of the 19th century? No, that is Elon Musk. Or is he the adherent of a more fundamental rethink? Put plainly, the West cannot transition to an alternate economic structure, such as a closed internal circulation model, precisely because it's so heavily invested ideologically in the philosophical underpinnings of the present one that to question these roots seems tantamount to a betrayal of European values and of the foundational libertarian values of America, drawn from the French Revolution. I find that last comment, okay, a little strange because, of course, the American Revolution preceded the French Revolution by 13 years. And the foundational libertarian values of America were present in time for the American Revolution. So Uh, I'm not sure where Alistair gets the idea that the foundational libertarian values of America are drawn from the French Revolution. Anyway, the reality is that today the Western vision of its claimed Athenian, quote, values, unquote, is as discredited as its economic theory in the rest of the world, as well as amongst a significant slice of its angry and disaffected own populations. So the bottom line is this: do not look to the European elites for any coherent view on the emergent world order. They're in collapse and are preoccupied by trying to save themselves amidst the crumbling of the Western sphere and the sphere of retribution um, um, from their electorates. This new era, however, also marks the end to, quote, old politics, the red versus blue, right versus left. Labels lose their relevance. New political identities and groupings are already being formed, even if their contours are not yet defined. And I think that last final statement is very true. We are in a time of transition. Uh, as the title of this post suggests, and we don't know quite the form that transition is going to take. It is true that transition to a new world order is beyond most in the West. It may not be beyond most in Russia or most in China or most in other nations that are taking an active part, in the transition. Uh, I think part of the transition, though, that we will see is a transition to MMT economics. We are seeing some attention being paid to MMT economics, both in Russia, and in China. They're taking that kind of thinking aboard, and I think that kind of thinking is very valuable. Uh, will be very valuable to the multipolar world, and will be part of the transition. So I'm going to now check and see if you have any comments on that. No further comments. Our attendance has increased, but our comments has not. Dee, any comments of yours on that last piece?
No, I have nothing to say. Huh.
Okay, so let's get to the final piece of the night. This is a video of a conversation that Nima had with, Larry Wilkerson.
Thank you.
God bless you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're not going to play the whole of this. It would take too long and is not all on the subject.
Do not buy new windows.
Uh, that we pulled this up for. We pulled up this video because we're interested in the question: is the U.S. on a collision course, with Iran? And that is very relevant because the talks between the U.S. and Iran
If you live in Virginia, Americans living in zip codes starting with 202
Wilkerson
have taken a turn for the worse. Specifically, in some of the early talks, there was no insistence by the United States, on the Iranians completely getting rid of their programs, of enrichment. Some uranium enrichment seemed to be acceptable to the United States, uh, but suddenly the United States seems to be shifting over to the position that the Iranians have to completely get rid of enrichment. And the Iranians are digging their heels in on that, as they well should, because they have every right to enrichment. They're signatories to the NPT treaty. In other words, the treaty against the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and they have always conformed to that particular treaty,
Mm-hmm.
and they still are conforming to it, today. Okay, now they are willing to uh, do more than simply conform to the treaty. They're willing to cut um, their enrichment down. Uh, they're currently at 61%. They're willing to cut that down uh, certainly to 20% and maybe even to 3.67%. Uh, but they're not willing to completely abandon it because they have every right to nuclear power. I mean, all the countries of the world have a right, to nuclear power. And to get, the nuclear power with present technology, you have to be able to enrich the uranium to 3.67%. Okay, so this is the issue that seems to be bringing the talks to a difficult point at this point. So that's the context for this discussion between Nima, and Larry Wilkerson. So there we go.
Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, May 20th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Wilkerson is back with us. Welcome back.
Good to be with you, Nina, as always. I don't see Larry Johnson. Where is he?
We're going to meet him on Friday.
Friday. Okay.
Colonel, let's get started. I'm going to get just used to Colonel because when we do the with Larry, it's just somehow getting confused.
Yeah. Larry 1 and Larry 2.
Colonel, the situation with Iran right now is somehow so much confused when you look at the way that the Trump administration is dealing with. And because so far we thought that Steve Witkoff would somehow be the voice of reason in the government, in the administration, that would bring some sort of insight from the mindset of the Trump administration. But here is what he said. I want to know what's your take on what he's offering.
People are dumping their $500 pressure washers for this $50 tool. The results speak for themselves. There's a new breakthrough in cleaning technology.
Well, the president has been very clear. He wants to solve this conflict diplomatically and with dialogue. And he's given all the signals. He's directly sent letters to the supreme leader. I have been dispatched to deliver that message as well, and I've delivered it. But on the other hand, we have one very, very clear red line, and that is enrichment. We cannot allow even 1% of an enrichment capability. We've delivered a proposal to the Iranians that we think addresses some of this without disrespecting them, and so that's important. We want to get to a solution here, and we think that we will be able to. But everything begins from our standpoint, John, with a deal that does not include enrichment. We cannot have that because enrichment enables weaponization, and we will not allow a bomb to get here. But short of that, there are all kinds of ways for us to achieve our goals in this negotiation. We think that we will be meeting sometime this week in Europe, and we hope that it will lead to some real positivity. And that's where we are, sir.
Okay, so let's look at this from the standpoint, okay, of reasonableness. We are
Hi, sweetheart.
huh?
Oh, I'm talking to my dog here.
We are signatories, okay, of the NPT treaty. The Iranians are signatories to the NPT treaty. The NPT treaty allows, enrichment, gives the right to enrichment to every nation that's a signatory of that particular treaty. Now, you cannot enrich to a level that allows you to get to 95%, which is what is necessary, for a nuclear weapon. Or maybe it's 90%, I forget. Okay. But you can enrich to lower levels than that. Everybody has the right, okay, to do that. But we are singling out, right, the Iranians and saying, we're not going to allow you to do that because we consider it a threat of some kind. Who are we to impose that on Iran? They are a sovereign nation of 92 million people, 93 million people. Not as large as our nation, of course.
Give me a second.
And we are a sovereign nation. How does one nation, one sovereign nation, threaten another sovereign nation with war on grounds that they are conforming to the NPT treaty that both nations have signed? What kind of reasonableness is that? I'll tell you what kind. I'll tell you
Hi,
what the
sweetheart.
reason for this is. The reason for this is that we are following a foreign policy that we think gives us the right to pursue the vital interests of another nation, 7,000 miles from our nation, specifically Israel. We consider the enrichment by Iran to be a threat to Israel that already has nuclear weapons, which are not subject to any regulation at all because Israel refused to sign the NPT treaty itself, or even to admit that it has nuclear weapons. But everybody knows that it has something like 200 to 300 warheads. Nobody brings that up in any discussion. The United States doesn't threaten Israel over its own breach of the NPT treaty. The Israelis are in breach of the NPT treaty.
Mm-hmm.
They never signed it.
Right.
But they're a nation that's in breach of that treaty. What do we want from Iran that is in compliance with that treaty and a signatory of that treaty? What right do we have to threaten Iran with war because they're perceived to be a threat to Israel? Why are we minding Israel's business? I'll tell you why. It's because we have a bunch of extremely rich donors inside of this country who have bought our political system. And so we're pursuing Israel's interest in West Asia instead of our own. Our own interest is not to have a war in West Asia. We don't gain anything from a war in West Asia. Anyway, let me go on with this.
Carl, when you look at here is what the supreme leader of Iran responded to the argument on the part of the Trump administration. He said the Trump administration should stop talking nonsense. For them to say we won't allow Iran to enrich uranium is utter nonsense. We are not waiting for anyone's permission. We'll pursue this.
It is utter nonsense. They have every right to say, we are not waiting for anyone's permission.
And the foreign minister of Iran said the same thing, that it doesn't matter if they get a deal or not, they're going to continue enriching uranium. But they can talk about the way the limits on the enriching uranium. Your take on what's going on in the Trump administration? Because somehow today I talked with Professor Morandi. They're so confused. They don't know what they're talking about. Each and every time coming out with a new rhetoric.
Witkoff just destroyed with that and other remarks he's made that are similar to that my impression, and it was only an impression, and I was looking for ramification of that impression, reinforcement of that impression, but he just destroyed my impression.
The superfood that helped me lose weight. This might be one of the healthiest foods on the planet, yet most people don't eat it.
My knowledge that he's a diplomat. He is sucking up to what everyone else in the Trump administration ultimately sucks up to, and that is the perplexity, the confusion, the mercurial nature, the non-steadfast approach of Donald Trump. He's become a clone of Donald Trump with just those short remarks you played there, because he has been all over the map. How could Iran have any trust whatsoever in what this man says from now on? Because he has been all over the map in the 3 meetings to this point, and he's been all over the map in indirect talks. I found out this morning there have been no direct talks. There have been a couple of remarks shared, but there have been no direct talks, as there should be. And at least one set of these talks ought to, maybe outside the framework, include an invitation from Tehran for Witkoff to come to Tehran and sit down and talk in Tehran. That hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened because this is an amateur hour presidency, particularly with regard to diplomacy. Iran's absolute will not drop, will not fall off position is very clear, just as Putin's is with regard to Ukraine, but no one will listen with ears to hear. It is that they are a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They signed up to the additional protocol. They signed up to the Safeguards Agreement. During the JCPOA, the IAEA could find no violations of significance to what they said they would do while remaining in the NPT with the privileges that that gives them.
So there you are. There you are. Larry stated it very, very directly. And what he said is completely true.
Mm-hmm.
Iranians are in compliance. They have a perfect right to continue to enrich uranium to the levels they've enriched it. Now, it's true that when you get to 61%, you're very, very close to getting to, nuclear grade levels. You are. But the only reason why they increased their enrichment from 20% to 60% was because Donald Trump got out of the original JCPOA. And the only way the Iranians were able to retaliate for that was for them to add to the enrichment, to show everybody that they had been bound by the treaty to 20%. But now that Trump had broken the treaty, they felt free to go to 61%, to get close to a nuclear weapons grade. It was part of their military strategy because, of course, they were afraid of a nuclear attack, from Israel. And they wanted to be close to the capability, but they also took the position that they thought nuclear weapons were a violation of their religion. So they never took the final step to nuclear weapons. Another very significant fact, of the Iranian position. They don't want to become a nuclear power in that sense. And if we leave them alone, they will never become a nuclear power.
So we're going to tell them that even though they are signatory to all these binding agreements and subject to the inspections of the IAEA, that they're different. They're different. They can't do what they have spent. And here's a key. Billions of dollars to develop and blood against that tyrant to the north in Israel to secure. Murdered scientists, blown up centrifuges, assassinations galore of their nuclear scientists. They've spent blood and billions, B squared, in order to do what they're doing, and it is perfectly permissible within the treaty regime that we supposedly support. Whereas that bastard state up there called Israel isn't even a member.
Were you born before 1959? If so, you can get $250 to spend at McDonald's completely free. And I can tell you right
and isn't doing anything in that regard. So if I were Iran, I would tell Witkoff and the U.S. to take a hike. We're not talking to you any further. Now they won't, because they don't want war. They've been clear about that too. They do not want war. And secondary to that, they want a relief of the sanctions. Trump in the Middle East in his talks, talking to the GCC and talking to Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed and others.
Okay, by the way, let me emphasize at this point, the sanctions against Iran are totally illegal according to international law. We have unilaterally placed those on Iran, and it's a violation of international law. Please keep that in mind. Now, this is not simply Trump's violation of international law. Our administrations have been violating international law for decades by putting unilateral economic sanctions on nations. We have to stop that. If the international community could come together and display any backbone, they could force us to get rid of all these sanctions. They are direct violations, of international law.
Look at Iran. Iran's a basket case economically, and you all are thriving. Why do you think they're a basket case, Donald Trump? Because U.S. sanctions are draconian. Why do you think you forced them in the arms of China and Russia and are going to force them even deeper into that embrace? Because that's the only way they can survive. Because you have so sanctioned them. Look at what happened to Syria. What happened to Syria in part was due to U.S. sanctions.
And by the way, all the things Larry just said are right. But by the way, I don't think Iran is any more a basket case. It's been terribly hurt by the sanctions, but the economic openings to Russia and China are starting to increase the strength of the economy of Iran. And I think they're beginning to gain a small measure of the prosperity which they are due.
Mm-hmm.
And it remains to be seen if that's a positive development. I hope it is. I hope it continues the way it is. U.S. sanctions are relieved and Syria has finally some prospects for the future. But Iran just wants the same thing. The other thing I've heard from the administration now is that they think, and I think I know who they are, they think that Iran, having had the axis of resistance destroyed around it, Hezbollah, Syria, the Houthis. I objected to that this morning when somebody told me, well, the Houthis are down too. The Houthis aren't down. They're still doing exactly what they were doing before. That Iran is weak, extremely weak, and has to do whatever we tell them to do. That's a terrible position to take in the negotiations because that's not the way Iran looks at it. That's not at all the way they look at it. Further, they think that, as I do, that the recent destabilization over the killing of the woman and abuse of women in general and other things and the women's movement in Iran, that the government has been delegitimized. Well, there's a certain truth to that. But then you have to throw out the reality. Remember 1980, 81 in there when Saddam decided that the revolution in Iran had made them extremely weak and it was a very good time for him to invade. And then he got his ass handed to him. Well, what you do when you invade a country or you bomb a country relentlessly, like we would have to do, is you solidify that population, that 85 to 90 million people, and they hate you, not their government. And that's what we would do. So this is the most amateur hour negotiating diplomatic team I've ever seen take to the field. In fact, I wouldn't even grace them with that term. They are not a diplomatic team. They're a herd of characters who don't know what the hell they're doing. And Witkoff has become one of that herd.
The fastest growing scam of 2025 is spreading like wildfire and wiping out bank accounts in seconds.
Larry, do you see Donald Trump? Because you've mentioned his visit to Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar. He said somehow he changed his rhetoric. He said before he was talking about if we can get a deal with Iran or we're going to attack them. And in the Middle East said we're going to get a deal or we're not going to let them selling any oil. Why is that changing in the mind of Donald Trump? Is he feeling that he cannot get a deal with Iran because of the pressure he's receiving from, I don't know, whoever is that is from Israel, from Israeli lobby, from the establishment? What's your take on that?
Either he's getting some really bad information from some of the sources you just identified, the neocons, for example, Rubio, for example, or he's just stupid. And I'm increasingly of the mind that it's both, but the latter really takes precedence. The man doesn't listen. He doesn't read. He doesn't pay attention. He bounces from one issue to another issue like a ping pong ball. And his criterion for bouncing is how much is in it for me, money-wise, for me and my family. So that's no way to go about negotiations of this serious nature. And I might just say the same thing about Ukraine, and ultimately I'd say the same thing about Gaza. This is not the leadership we need at this time. The reality of what would happen if we didn't get a deal, let's just say we even go into a phase 2, that we don't get one before August, let's say. It's just too painful for the Iranians, too painful for us. We actually exercise some diplomacy. They do too. And we get to a point where both sides are saying something like, well, we need a phase 2. We didn't do it in the first phase. We need a phase 2. Well, what are you going to do about the snapback sanctions and the E3? What are you going to do about those people? Not just the UN sanctions, which will snap back. You can maybe take care of that, except guess who's coming into the presidency of the Security Council at that time? Russia. Maybe you could get that done, though, but you still got the E3 sanctions. You still got the European sanctions. And we aren't on really the best terms in the world with Europe right now. Although Europe is concerned about Iran's program, they're probably not as concerned about it as we are. So are they going to do what we need them to do? Probably not. So you're just pushing this down the road into intractable territory for successful negotiations. So ultimately, Donald, you're going to get what you say you don't want. You're going to get a war. And in this whole time, if Bibi's government hasn't collapsed, which I think is probably at least a 50-50 chance of, and we don't have new leadership in Israel, and we haven't brought the hammer down on the genocide and the starvation in Gaza, then you've got Israel to worry about starting something, because they're going to see, well, they're going to a phase 2, and maybe the sanctions are going to be lifted at least partially, or maybe that's a product of a phase 2. Can't let this happen. So they start the war. So you're playing with real fire here, and you don't have diplomats with any fire extinguishers. And it's really worrisome to see this happening, because I know what's going to result if we do go into conflict. We're going to lose, and we're going to lose big time. Iran's going to lose too. There's no question about that. There's going to be no winners in this. So if we do resolve this down to the point where Donald Trump is forced to make a decision to unleash the U.S. military, he is also going to unleash a colossal wreck of Southwest Asia, much more deeply, much more widespread, much more long-term and lasting than Iraq was. The old expression, if you liked Iraq, wait till you see Iran. It's going to be extremely, extremely bad for both sides. And it's going to be for no purpose. That's the real irritating factor. No purpose. Iran does not represent a threat to anyone in the region that can't handle that threat, as it were. And I don't even think they represent a threat anymore. And it certainly doesn't present a threat to the United States, which is going to be paying a huge burden in coin, treasure, blood, and everything else. Lack of focus on the real threat, if there is one, China. It's a recipe for disaster, Nima. And I don't see any cooks. I don't see any chefs. I don't see any master chefs. I don't see anyone who knows what they're doing, including the President of the United States. And now my only hope, Witkoff, has become a vassal of Donald Trump's mercurial, vacillating nature. That is not a recipe for good things.
I couldn't believe how much mucus came out of my lungs the first time I tried this. It felt like I could finally breathe.
You mentioned.
Okay, so that's it. I wanted you to see that part and what Larry had to say, okay, about that part. Then I wanted to comment on how Trump, okay, is losing it because he doesn't have the will, okay, to go through a deal. He seemed to want a deal, okay, with Russia. He had the 2-hour phone call, with Putin. He expressed all sorts of willingness to deal with Russia. But he can't take the actions necessary to close a deal with Russia. The obvious action is he's got to abandon the course of the United States in wanting to support proxy war to hurt Russia, to break up Russia.
Mm-hmm.
He wants peace. He has to stop that proxy war. But he won't take the final step to stop it. He doesn't seem to have the will to do that. With Iran, okay, the negotiations that were taking place, they were down to the point, okay, where Iran would have accepted a deal where enrichment stopped at 3.67%, far less than Iran was entitled to by the NPT. Even the medical applications, of nuclear science involving enrichment of 20%, they were going to give up. Give their uranium that was at 20% up to Russia to hold it for them in case we broke the deal. Then the Russians would give them back the uranium enriched to 20%. And they would go ahead again and enrich themselves to 20%. But they were even ready to go that far and not do any further enrichment to 20% themselves, but get the uranium they needed from Russia for medical purposes. Restrict their own enrichment to 3.67%. That's where the negotiations ended. They were agreeing to all kinds of international inspections. They were agreeing to a permanent deal at this point, not to a temporary deal like the JCPOA. The JCPOA was a 10-year deal. They were willing to give up their right to enrich beyond 3.67% forever. And Trump wouldn't close the deal. He wouldn't close the deal. Why? Because there was some Rand Corporation paper some time ago that said if there's any enrichment at all, it's a slippery slope to becoming a nuclear power. Rand wrote this paper some time ago. It doesn't really have anything to recommend it. It's just an assertion. There's no proof that there's any slippery slope involved. Certainly not if you're limited to 3.67%. But somehow in the U.S. defense community, this Rand Corporation report is some kind of gospel. And Trump's advisors started quoting him from this report. And he got cold feet. And he went back to the position of no enrichment for the Iranians at all. This is so unreasonable. Okay. And by the way, I doubt that he's really going to fight a war over it. I think he's bluffing. He saw what the Houthis did to the U.S. carriers. He saw what the Houthis are doing to Israel. The Iranians have what? 20 times the capability of the Houthis. There's no way we could win a war against them. I don't even think there's a way we can win a stalemate against them. If we start a war with them, yeah, we'll start an economic crisis for them. Even then, it won't be as bad as it might have been. You know, they might block the Straits of Hormuz and no oil would proceed, through that area. But guess what? They've opened up a rail line now to send the oil by rail to China. So they could still sell their huge quantities of oil to China. We would not even perhaps be able to stop that. They could destroy all the 68 U.S. bases surrounding them. They could destroy a good part of Israel if we start a war with them. Trump has been briefed on their capability. And by the way, that capability has been increasing month after month since last October. They just threw 100 missiles at Israel rather casually, which the Iron Dome failed to stop, just a couple of days ago. It was just a little demonstration of what they could do. But the Iranian air defenses are much stronger now than they were last October. And in the coming months, they're going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. Because the Russians, if they have not already done so, are going to start shipping S-500 systems to the Iranians. The S-500 systems can knock the F-35s out of the sky. And they can do a pretty good job on the best missiles that the United States and Israel have. That is not a war that we can sustain. And I think Trump is going to hesitate to pull the trigger on that war, whatever he's threatening at this point. He blusters and blusters and blusters, but in a lot of situations he backs down, such as on the tariffs. He backed down against the Houthis. So what is he moving towards? He's moving towards a situation where he's going to back down. He's not going to start a war, against the Iranians. He's just going to leave the situation as it is without an agreement. So with all this fuss, he won't have gained anything because he won't pull the trigger on the final step and say yes. He won't get to yes. Anyway, that's my commentary.
Mm-hmm.
D, you got anything to add?
Um, you hear so many different things because Israel right now, there are reports out that Israel, I mean, they could be lying, but they're saying, they're planning to attack Iran. And it's just ridiculous.
Yes, it is. It would be suicide to attack Iran. I mean, not, of course, for us, but it would be suicide for our assets in West Asia. They would go up in smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Israel, a large part of Israel would be destroyed. I think the Iranians have the capability to hit Israel with 3,000 hypersonic missiles. There's going to be nothing but chaos in Israel if that occurs. The whole of Israeli society will be destroyed.
And as we have witnessed the restraint that Iran has, that Iran doesn't want this. They're focused on themselves, their economy. They don't want any of this.
The only other thing they want is they want the genocide of the Palestinians to stop. They want Palestinian self-determination. They think that's a moral issue.
Mm-hmm.
They want a two-state solution in Palestine. They would
Yes.
support that. That is the position of the United Nations. That is the official position of the United States. Of course, lots of people in government work against that position all the time. They're obviously in favor, of Greater Israel, but nevertheless, that's the official position of the United States. It's time for us to follow through and say yes to the official position.
Right, because we are the problem.
We are the problem because we insist in supporting Israel, however unreasonable Israel becomes.
And look where we're at now. Look at where the world is at now.
In the early part of this stream, we went over that piece from Alistair Crook and his wife, that appeared on Larry Johnson's website, quoting all of the examples from the Israeli press of the extreme opinions floating around in Israel now. All of the evidence of the shift to fascism over in Israel. It's not even simply fascism. It's an Israeli version of Nazism.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it is.
Right. It's a dangerous mind. It's a dangerous mindset.
It's a dangerous mindset. And we are supporting that at our own peril and at the peril of the continued existence of Israel itself. We have to stop. We have to support what's reasonable, what's fair, and what's just. We have to punish the genociders for their war crimes. We have to allow the Palestinians the right of self-determination. It's a right guaranteed by the UN Charter. The Israelis and the United States have been denying that right for decades. That has to stop. And we have to begin by putting through this agreement with the Iranians and by backing off our threats. Peace with Iran is the first step to climbing down off the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
We need to do that because it's a destructive mountain
Yes.
that we've climbed. Destructive for everyone. And another risk, of nuclear war. Evelina asks, well, first she says we had hopes for Witkoff, too bad. She says, isn't it true that even if Trump wanted to deal with Iran, the war are a factor he has to contend with? Yeah, he has to contend with, but he can make a deal with Iran. In spite of the war hawks, he retains enough power to make a deal with Iran. I don't know if he can get the deal through Congress in full treaty mode, but he should at least be able to get a congressional executive agreement through. That agreement would last beyond his presidency, even though it wasn't a full treaty. So he could do that. And that's the first step to defusing the tensions in West Asia. Then Trump needs to turn to Israel. He needs to get them to climb off the mountain too. He needs to inform them about the Iranian capabilities to destroy them, and he needs to educate them to understand they aren't going to beat Iran. They need to do self-determination for the Palestinians. They need to stop the genocide.
Yes.
Oh, a partial treaty would look the same, as a regular treaty. It looks exactly the same. It, just wouldn't be ratified by, I think it's 2/3 of the Senate is necessary to ratify a treaty. So it wouldn't be ratified by the Senate, but it would receive a majority vote in both the House and the Senate. So it would be a congressional executive agreement, it's called. There are 3 levels of agreement. There's an executive agreement, which is an agreement the president makes, with a foreign country. Then there's a congressional executive agreement, which is agreement that receives a majority of vote in both houses of Congress and which is agreed to by the president. And then there's, a full-blown treaty, which is a treaty that actually gets ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. And of course, is subscribed to by the executive branch. So those are the 3 levels. A treaty, becomes, it's the supreme law, of the land, for the United States, just under the Constitution in terms of the supremacy, of that law. Can be superseded by the Constitution, of course. But otherwise, it has the full power of domestic law. So, I think if there are no more comments, that brings this stream to a close. I hope you all enjoyed it. The attendance was fairly good tonight at 34 people. So
That's good.
And I personally liked the stream very much. I hope that you do too.
Yes, I did. We talked about the various issues and brought it up to date.
Yes. Oh, so Bonnie says everybody share it.
Yes, please share. That's so important.
Of course, yes, share, like, and subscribe. We need to get a bit of an aftermarket here because I think this stream was important.
Hmm.
So again, thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. And good night, Bonnie.
Good night.
Okay, thank you, Dee, for joining tonight.
It was a great show.
Okay,
Yes, it was a great show. Yes. Thank you.
and so, well, that's it, I guess. So I'm going to say good night also. And there we go.
Can I talk now?
I'm not done yet.